Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining our webinar today. We'll be talking about how to create a great user experience with Teams and SharePoint. Just a couple of notes on housekeeping before we get started. Take a moment and see if you can find the Q&A panel. That's what we'll be using to address any questions, or you can share comments in that panel, and we'll get to as many as we can at the end of the webinar. We also are recording the session, and we'll be sharing that on YouTube, and I'll send out an email about that afterwards. So our topic today, what we'll cover, is a brief history of user experience in SharePoint. It's come a long way, so we'll talk about that just briefly. Then why the user experience and focusing on that is important. And then we'll get to some fundamentals and look through some examples of Teams and SharePoint. So my name is Jazz, and I have been working at Gravity Union for almost 2 years now. I have a number of years working in the enterprise technology space, and I've seen the ups and downs of user experience in that space. And previously, I worked at Microsoft, and I've been a UX designer as well. So I'll hand it over to Michael, who will walk us through some of the scenarios today.
Thanks, Jazz. Michael Schweitzer, I'm the CEO and President of Gravity Union. Lots of experience, and I'll be taking you through the webinar today. So a little bit about Gravity Union. We're a Microsoft partner and a collaborative partner with people across Canada. I'm actually located in Vancouver, and Jazz is all the way over in Moncton today in the Eastern Bubble, staying safe. We're also a great place to work for those of you looking for a job. We're lucky to be chosen by Microsoft to work with them as a content services partner. So we're part of that program, kind of giving them feedback on the platform, the roadmap, and where things are going. And we've got a bunch of fun stats about the company, about all the millions of documents that we've migrated over into SharePoint, into thousands and thousands of document libraries, and had a lot of success with that. And so we're sharing some of those lessons learned today. We're also makers of Moat. So we launched this product last month, which is an archiving tool for the Office 365 audit trail, which can disappear on you after 3 months or 1 year, depending on your license. So talking a little bit about a brief history of UX in SharePoint. I mean, it used to be pretty bad. It used to require lots of custom effort. I remember back in the day, Jazz and I used to work on these large, year-long custom SharePoint projects. And a significant effort was, fixing the user experience through, JavaScript and CSS and HTML. And oftentimes, too, people weren't happy with the out-of-the-box behavior. And so people were changing things, and that was kind of problematic because as you upgraded to the various versions of SharePoint, it would often cause problems with those migration processes, and you have to redo things and make things more expensive. And it's kind of funny because I was actually working on this slide yesterday, and then Jeff Tupper, who runs the SharePoint program at Microsoft, tweeted, happy birthday, SharePoint. So I believe they're actually hit 20 years old today, which is pretty old for a software platform, but we can certainly see it's come a long way in the past 20 years. Gosh, the old site's looking pretty bad from 2001. The screenshot on the right there is taken from the SharePoint lookbook. And if you were to go Google that, you'll see they have a whole bunch of really cool examples of how you can kind of tailor the look and feel, at least of SharePoint, to make it look super nice. And that's all out of the box functionality. Again, which used to take a lot of effort from a customization standpoint. So, why focusing on the user experience is important. I think one of the reasons why we would decide to do the webinar today is we've certainly seen a lot of adoption into Office 365, Microsoft 365, with Teams and SharePoint, and certainly a rush to get into those platforms, and maybe through just sheer having to deal with a pandemic, didn't necessarily have the time to focus on that. So going to give some tidbits on how maybe we can fix some of those issues, and when you're creating net new SharePoint sites or Team sites, what we can do to improve the experience. So why is it important? When we're talking about the user experience in SharePoint, we're sort of talking like large scale enterprise content management, rolling out dozens or hundreds of departmental sites and creating places for people to work and collaborate on a daily basis. And this comes from AIM. There's still lots of large scale ECM projects that don't necessarily deliver on what they promised. And when going through a recent report, certainly some things would be that disregard for adoption, user experience, and companies tend to focus more on just getting it done versus doing it right. And so point one is adoption, point six is just sort of ignoring that end user experience, so on and so forth. And so we know that a good user experience really does drive adoption, which is fun, which is really what we want for these platforms. And although we're not necessarily having, I think we have seen a shift in this. I think the necessity to work from home during the pandemic has sort of been a bit of a stick to get people as a motivational tool to kind of get people to work in the platforms. But certainly, you know, we're going to see perhaps some frustration and the throwing away of sites that weren't developed properly as the, you know, those sites grow and uncontrolled and ungoverned and maybe weren't designed properly to begin with. So certainly, you know, focusing on user experience, you will have less friction when adopting the software, which leads to greater adoption. And just a good quote from Forrester Research, you know, that experience of perhaps an over-designed SharePoint solution when you're updating or uploading a document and you're being prompted for 10 or 20 or 30 items of metadata, and people just tend to stop using systems that are too much effort and too much work. So, you know, one big thing is when we focus on the user experience, you know, we tend to improve search of content, and so the findability of content improves and increases, and so that means it's going to be a lot easier for people to find stuff. They're going to, you know, be less likely to print off policies and procedures and keep a local paper copy or you know, store copies on their desktop, etc. We're going to be less likely to make decisions based on erroneous data, so you're not going to stumble across an old contract and make decisions based off of that. You're less likely to need to recreate documents that can't be found, and certainly more likely to find the right information that you need to make decisions and support processes in the organization. So when we focus on the user experience and we create, you know, meaningful metadata and great structures and URLs and stuff like that, search improves and we get a bunch of benefits from that. We also find that it improves compliance. So, you know, first off, a higher adoption certainly means that we have more documents in the system that we can manage and classify as records. And then we sort of have, you know, when we find is when we create those really cool, meaningful solutions, those in turn give us the detail that we need to automate the records management piece, which is pretty critical. So being able to auto classify content or be able to push things forward or automatically archive content in an easy and meaningful way, it typically improves when we focus on the user experience. So we almost could have labeled this webinar, you know, things that how could you set up SharePoint to improve compliance, or how can you set up SharePoint to improve your ROI? Very similar topics. So we do see an increased ROI as well. So what we talked about, of course, we're getting a return on investment from search and adoption and compliance, which is awesome. But what we also see, and we got some good examples that we'll look at today, what we'll see is, you know, when we have sort of a messy SharePoint site that we didn't take the time to design properly, and we have, you know, thousands of documents and folders, and it's ungoverned, and it's kind of hard to navigate. I mean, people are frustrated. When we see, you know, when we see organizations stop and take the time to fix that or do it right to begin with, their activities downstream tend to focus more on high value activities. So instead of focusing on reworking SharePoint sites and trying to fix these user experience problems, we see a shift to focusing on added value activities like creating workflows or custom applications, those power apps, low code solutions to provide some value. Or maybe we want to layer on artificial intelligence, or we want to do some automation, or whatever that happens to be. So you certainly see companies get more out of the platform when they take a user experienced approach to developing their solution moving forward. And I would say it takes more effort to rearrange SharePoint than it does to get it right the first time. And so we often see organizations, you know, rush to move into SharePoint, and perhaps some executives are giving people an unrealistic, you know, 3-month time horizon to just get into SharePoint for now. And that's a win unto itself. And I guess to a degree that would have been true during the pandemic. So it does allow people to work from home. But typically it does take more effort. SharePoint's a little bit more sticky than, say, network file storage. Or even email, let's say. And so once it's in SharePoint, it's certainly going to be more effort to rearrange things and move things around and to dial things in right. as well as if we've done, if we've done a simple SharePoint solution and we're using folders and there's no rich metadata or content types, then we're perhaps, reinforcing bad behavior in the system, and then that's going to be more effort to sort of untrain those people. And we'll probably have a steeper change curve in the organization when rolling things out. So, what are we talking about when we're controlling the user experience in SharePoint? Really the things on the left are the things that we want to focus on. So naming conventions, metadata, what are we asking for? Is the metadata useful for end users? How we order content, how we organize it, what we're showing, how we create our content types, our search, our page layouts. That's all the stuff that sort of SharePoint gives us as levers or controls in the system to create the user experience. And then, oftentimes you may come across this. It's becoming less prevalent now in SharePoint Online, but people might be happy with some of the user experience within SharePoint. So, how we set metadata, or how we check in or check out, or how I share stuff. And so oftentimes when organizations go down the path of trying to control certain dimensions of user experience, which are really controlled by SharePoint, or by Microsoft rather, it ends up being a bit of a lot of effort for kind of little value. And so you probably don't want to focus on trying to change out of the box behavior so much as focusing and doubling down on the areas where we have control, where it's relatively easy. So let's this is sort of my take on the fundamentals of creating a user experience within the SharePoint environment. And I've sort of, and perhaps these are sort of to a degree overlapping and interconnected. But I think it'll be a good exercise to kind of walk through what are the three dimensions or the kind of main factors that we have to moving into or managing that user experience. And I added one last one there. We have two, should be three. So, we talk about the visual appeal. So just making it nice to look at. I got a really funny example of a really horrible looking website and the impact that has on end users. The mental effort, so what we refer to as cognitive load. So how much effort does it take for me to digest what I'm seeing on the screen, and then perhaps the physical effort. So how many clicks and how many actions and how many things, like what do I have to do? How many actions does it take me to complete a task? And that's certainly going to be a barrier for people and detract from the user experience. So from a visual appeal standpoint, we can use consistent colors and fonts and styles to make the site attractive, which can certainly in and of itself ease user frustration. We can use that look and feel to draw the eye to different areas, make it clear for people what you're supposed to do, make use of white space to make it a bit more of a relaxing site, not to overload what people are seeing from a visual perspective. So I Googled this morning, the ugliest website in the world, and this is what came up. But yeah, when we look at this, it's not totally clear where I should be going or what I'm doing, and it's kind of hard on the eyes, and is certainly a negative experience. And when we compare and contrast that with, say, the SharePoint lookbook experience, it's quite a drastic change, and you're probably even feeling, looking at the previous slide there, it probably made you a bit anxious and a bit frustrated just looking at this versus looking at a nicely well laid out SharePoint site that is easy to read. We're not overloading with too much content. We're making use of color patterns and designs and fonts, and it's well organized, and it's really easy to dart around the page and see what you're supposed to do and where you're supposed to go. So, we can certainly do a whole webinar on visual design and visual appeal, but certainly creative things that you could do in your organization, or certainly if you have an existing branding standard, if not, maybe create one for SharePoint and engage with whoever owns branding at your organization. Certainly govern the look and feel. You don't necessarily want to hand the keys over to the end users and allow them to choose colors and add pictures and stuff like that, because chances are it'll detract from the end user experience. And then maybe you want to hire a designer if you're focusing on maybe an employee portal where design's a bit more of a factor. So that's the first thing. The second thing would be the mental effort, what we call cognitive load. So it's the amount of mental effort that we're expending to understand what we're looking at. And so we know that the more complex the system is, the higher the workload is for us to think about doing things and performing work and making decisions. And I remember reading a study on, say, on the example of having too many choices. And I think it was the example was a jam company that when they went to supermarkets and displayed 3 types of jams, say strawberry, raspberry, and blueberry, their sales were quite high. But once they exceeded a certain number of jams on the table, so if they put 20 jams on the table from a selection standpoint, their sales drop completely, and the theory is that, hey, you're just going to give people too many options, it's too much to think about, and people would have a tendency to kind of walk on and not want to deal with the complexity of choosing their favorite jam among 20 jams. So, maybe an example is a good example would be an aircraft, and if you've ever looked into the cockpit, it's certainly an overwhelming experience, and no individual constituent switch or dial on that plane is overly complex, but it's in aggregate, it can become overwhelming for people. And so if I was to ask you, well, what speed is the airplane going right now? It might take you 10 minutes to look at each dial and try and figure out what those dials are telling you, what information there is on the plane. And we can get around complexity through training efforts. But it takes several thousand hours to train a pilot on flying a 747, and we're typically given only a couple hours to train people on SharePoint and Teams and stuff like that. So when we compare and contrast that to something like a Tesla, where, hey, we're really just trying to minimize the information that we're showing you at any given point in time. If I was to ask you, what gear we're in, what speed are we going? Where are we? Much easier to do in this environment versus this environment. And and from perhaps from a SharePoint standpoint, it might look something like this, where we're just showing you too much information. There's too much going on. We're showing you a bunch of stuff that you don't care about, et cetera, et cetera. And we'll dig into some of these examples later on in the webinar. So how can we control cognitive load? We can certainly minimize the volume of content being shown. So, some examples of that could be, by default, if I go to a document library with invoices, I could potentially, by default, just show you the invoices that still haven't been paid yet, because those are the invoices that I have to deal with. Minimizing the number of options that a user has for a given scenario. Minimizing the information that we ask from users. Certainly making sure that we're asking, information that is meaningful for them, being mindful how we name things, being mindful how we organize things. And we can't cover it all today, but, for example, naming conventions. And so we certainly want to avoid funny names and creative names and all caps. And, sometimes we need to create a distinct content type or column, and we want to use tax amount, but it's already taken, so we add underscores or remove spaces or add dollar signs. And when we do that, it takes an extra second. And maybe you're thinking to yourself right now, well, that's not a big deal. I can certainly understand that the word tax amount is there, but it's compounding with other design decisions that we make in the solutioning. So if I go to a page and I'm showing you 1 million items and I'm showing you 50 rows of metadata, and on top of that, I'm now making you take an extra half second to understand what those columns are and what the meaning is. It's these hundreds of micro decisions that go into the development of your SharePoint or Teams site that add up together, and it can either detract from user experience or add to it. So anything that we can do to make it easier to understand, easier to read, easier to organize will go a long way, and they really add up to make a powerful user experience. We talk about ordering. Oftentimes people by default want to order alphabetically, and that works for sometimes. Like if I'm scanning a list of employee names, for example, alphabetical makes sense, but oftentimes our content isn't quite that simple, and it actually makes more sense to organize things by popularity, or what's the likelihood or what's the need of me to find that content. I remember working with a power delivery company, a transmission line in Ontario, and one thing that they had in SharePoint was a list of houses of people who had basically at-home life support, and so it was kind of really critical for them that on the landing page of their SharePoint site that they were able to get to this list of people who needed to have their power turned on first, literally a life or death situation. We wouldn't want to have a link to that document, buried 17 layers deep in a site and hard to find, difficult to find. And so we typically scan from left to right and from top to bottom. So placing things in the order of the most likely to click means that as I'm scanning that content, I'm more likely going to be able to find what I'm looking for at an earlier point in time. And if you're questioning that, you even go on to look into the SharePoint backend, and what we actually see is they do this exact same thing. When I go to the site settings button in SharePoint Online, the first thing they show you is recycling bin, because that's the most common thing, right? I've deleted a document, I'm freaking out, I got to go deliver this thing to my boss, and I want to know where that recycling bin is. And then we look down at the bottom, there's some site collection upgrade button. I've never even pressed that. I'm not even totally sure what it does. I mean, I'm sure it upgrades the site collection to some degree, but I haven't had to click that in my 15 plus years of working in SharePoint. And so that's probably common for most people, and so they put it at the bottom of the list. So when I come into these various areas, they've certainly ordered the menus and the navigation by the order of popularity or the order of the likelihood of clicking on that link. And so again, it's one of these micro decisions where I come into the site and we're making things easy to read, and we're trying to minimize the information that we're showing. And on top of that, we're going to organize things and name things in a meaningful way. The little things that add up to create a really good user experience. And then we can talk about physical effort. So there's obviously some overlap between the two. But how many clicks are we? You probably all heard this when talking about software design or system design. Like, how many clicks is it going to be? And we want a good user experience, and we don't want to go 20 levels deep. And there's some things that we can do, with that. And so to reuse the previous quote, again, if we're asking you to enter in 11 metadata fields, people can get frustrated, especially when the metadata fields are something you're not even sure about, like some project category code or something kind of meaningless that doesn't really add to the current solution from a user experience standpoint. So how can we control physical effort? We can co-locate related items either physically or through search. So if maybe I need access to a purchase order for my project, but technically that document lives in the finance site, I could use search, or I could simply provide a link to that, but not having to hop around from site to site or from folder to folder. So co-location can go a long way. Avoid noisy metadata. This is a bit of a pet peeve of mine. So oftentimes when we start talking about metadata, people think of every possible metadata item that you could ever dream of. And sometimes it's politically motivated for them. So for example, people might not want the responsibility of having their name assigned to a document that was added to SharePoint. And so they want to capture, well, who's the original author, and what was the original document date, and who's the document owner, et cetera, et cetera. And it's just a slippery slope, and you go down this path where I'm trying to add an invoice, and all I probably care about is who's the vendor, right? Where did this invoice come from, and perhaps when it's due. When we're inputting metadata into systems, we really want to only be asking people for 2 or 3 max, let's say 5 at max. And there are exceptions. I'll even show you an exception today, which is how we run our RFP processes. But avoid anything that's not really truly adding value. If I'm not going to search, sort, or filter the content in a normal business scenario on that metadata, we probably don't need to capture it. And then in the cases where we do, like maybe you want to capture, well, what's the department? Maybe it's useful to understand what department owns a given piece of content. In that case, typically in the way that you would design systems, your various document libraries, you're going to have a document library for job descriptions that's really only used by human resources. And so we can certainly do a default value, or use artificial intelligence, or use Power Automate, or some other mechanism to capture that additional metadata that we want to capture, and minimize what we're asking from the end user. Certainly avoid folders, and we're going to show you the first thing today. But there are cases where it makes sense, and I'll even call out Teams as one of those examples. And so if you're spinning up a team to run a quick project, certainly you could spend the time to create templates in Teams and use PnP, PowerShell scripts to automate the provisioning of team sites based off templates. And certainly a lot of our clients are doing that we're working with right now. But if you need a team in a hurry and it's a temporary thing and it's just a quick committee, throw it up there and allow people to use folders. I think I'm okay with that. However, yeah, like the big picture, when we use folders, we have a tendency to hide data, and I would say, more often than not, when organizations are using folders, it means they've simply lifted and shifted content from network file storage and just kind of plopped it in SharePoint instead of reorganizing and rethinking that content and how do we want to work with it and what actually is useful for end users to capture. And so one rule of thumb that we follow is that we typically want to ensure that document libraries have a single purpose in the system. So a document library should contain policies, or it should contain invoices, or it should, and maybe you want to have a document library for a project, maybe that's okay. You could still argue it's a single purpose. But where people run into problems are, well, I've got a document library and I'm storing policies, procedures, and contracts and job descriptions and something else. And we run into, security issues, we run into scalability issues with that, lots of clicking, lots of subfolders, and we kind of go down a bit of a messy path that is hard to undo. And this is a bit of an example. So it's a bit of an old school content type. But this is when we let information management people design metadata outside of the context of a good user experience. You can imagine it's Friday afternoon, your partner or spouse is outside, and you're uploading a document into SharePoint, and it's asking you to fill out, these default columns, and perhaps your company has added department and function and activity and a bunch of stuff that you probably don't care about. And what is a resource identifier? And so, it's going to take you 2 or 3 minutes to enter all the stuff in, and maybe you're asking for some abstract stuff that really provides no value. So if I'm adding an invoice again, I want to know who the vendor is, maybe when the invoice is due. Maybe I want to know the invoice amount, but I might not trust myself to open that PDF and copy the invoice amount and put it into SharePoint. So again, from a high level conceptual thing, we're talking about all these little tiny decisions that we make in our system around visual appeal, cognitive load, and physical effort add up and are kind of overlapping to a degree. And I've kind of superficially separated them today, but they all really do add up, and it's really every decision that you take around organization and naming and where we're placing things and how we're doing things add up to either create a great experience or perhaps a poor one. So let's look at a couple of examples today. So the first one we'll bring over is a folder-based approach. So this is quite a common scenario that we see. Maybe we roll out SharePoint and we're in a bit of a hurry, and so this is our proposals solution here. And I simply dragged and dropped a partial network file storage solution into SharePoint. And so, first off, looking at this and passing judgment on it, if you will, like the notion of documents, not super clear what's contained in that document set. We perhaps have a bunch of links here on the left-hand side that we're not using and is just kind of cluttering up the user experience. If I go into, say, the proposals area, we're seeing a bunch of information here. And so, to again, looking at this, most of this information, and you may be laughing to yourself right now, but we actually have several clients who have done some stuff like this. So we're just showing a bunch of information that has nothing to do with the proposal, the department, function, activity, showing the file size and the version. None of this is really adding to the experience. It's not how we think about our proposals. And when I say proposals, we're talking about from a consultancy standpoint. So when a large organization goes to market and they want to do an RFP, or we want to propose or send a proposal in to do some work, we'll collaborate together and work on that. And so, we have seen people roll out systems like this where we're capturing a bunch of metadata information, but that doesn't really help the cause. Like, I want to know, well, who is the vendor, or when's the proposal due, or who's working on this, or what type of proposals is this SharePoint on premises? Is this Teams? Is this Microsoft 365? Is it an Exchange migration? And so, and we're also showing a bunch of information that it's certainly a bit of an overload. Certainly overkill. We're not giving you the ability to like by default, I have no idea which proposals due next or how to find the one that I want to work on. Now, obviously, I've kind of made up something trying to hide who our clients are, but or potential clients, but imagine these would be names of various organizations throughout Canada and the States. So yeah, so kind of a negative experience, and you actually see it's actually a little bit slow as I'm scrolling down. So the more content we have in document library, the slower it gets. If I go into a given folder, I got to go into other folders and going back and forth, and I'm having to do more clicks to get around and navigate this content. Going back up to the root there, so that's sort of a negative experience around that. So if we go into back to the root and we go into, say, our resumes and profiles, again, most of the stuff that we have here really has nothing to do with the resumes that we have for our consultants. Another problem that we have with just sort of leveraging one document library and kind of throwing everything in here and not really capturing meaningful metadata is if when we want to perhaps enhance the solution and make it better. So let's just say I want to go add a column, and let's say, hey, it'd be important for me to understand what type of person or what kind of employee these people are. I might want to add a short hide columns there. I don't know if I have one there. I don't have anything meaningful. Okay, so I'm going to add a new column. We'll make it a choice column. We're going to call this employment type, and the first choice could be contract, and the second choice could be employee. Click save. Okay, so that's kind of cool, and so I can go into here and go into edit and grid view, and now I can select the type of or employment that the person is for the organization. And so while this is kind of cool, the downfall again for the single document library and just kind of lifting and shifting and putting stuff in here, when I go to proposals and look over to the right, we now have employment type for proposals, and that just doesn't make any sense. We don't need the type of employment for our proposals in here. And so now we can go, well, we can go create a new view, one just for employee, let's say one for resumes, if I could spell resumes, create. And we can go in and filter this out to just show more meaningful metadata. What's going to happen is we're going to end up with several views for resumes and several views for proposals and several views for other stuff. So we'll end up with dozens and dozens of views on the right hand side here. So again, a lot of problems just kind of lifting and shifting folders, not really taking the time. We didn't take the time here to capture meaningful metadata. We're showing too much information at once. Oftentimes when we're submitting proposals, we're in a bit of a hurry, we have a deadline, and we want to come in here and just see, the most important information, quickly get to that RFP response and upload it to a bid website or something like that. So certainly lots of problems there. And so you can imagine, well, now when we talk about, investing in user experience up front and how perhaps it's more effort to fix it moving forward, well, now I have to, we have a problem here. I have a document library with multiple purposes, and it's hard for me to create a compelling user experience or to do other things like records management. We don't really have the detail in here to do records management. It would be difficult for us to do workflow. Workflow often requires that we add additional columns of metadata to capture state or what's happened or if it's been approved or not. And I don't want, say, the approval of a proposal to show up on the resume, for example, or the little snippets that we would have in for our proposals. So yeah, so kind of a thing, not the end of the world. Is it usable? Sure, but certainly going to slow people down. People will be frustrated with this, and we can certainly do a lot better with regards to a solution. So perhaps taking a step in the right direction. So, the first thing you'd want to do is let's pull this apart and make sort of purposeful document libraries. And so this would be an example of a similar solution, only if I go into the proposals library now. So now what we've done is we have a purposeful library that's been built out. We actually are capturing lots of metadata. I've broken my own rule, but again, once in a while, it's still going to be okay to capture a bunch of metadata on here, especially for really important bits of content. And so And so this is much better. And we're not capturing the function and activity and department. We're capturing the stuff that is important for dealing with proposals. What's the proposal number? I might want to search for that at some point in the future. What's the project name? What province was it in? What year was it from? When's the due date? When do we have to have this proposal due? When's it modified by, etc. So we've got a bunch of really great, meaningful metadata in here, still showing lots of information, but certainly a step in the right direction with regards to crafting a usable user experience. And then again, think about this, comparing, contrasting this to the folder selection now. So this solution's at a point now where, hey, if we want to, add some default metadata, or if I want to apply some artificial intelligence or do some records management, we have this detail in the solution. Or if I want to do a cool workflow, or if I want to do a Power App, or I can do reporting on here. How many did we win versus lose and stuff like that. We have way more ability with this type of solution to do added value activities, reporting, artificial intelligence, workflow, records management. And so again, imagine 2 or 3 years out, the two different solutions. With the folder solution, it's going to be a bit of a headache. It's going to be messy. It's going to be hard to govern. People won't be happy with it. And you're going to have to spend some time. You have to go buy ShareGate or write a bunch of scripts and move content around and try and fix things. Versus organization B here is going to be free to focus on workflows, records management, more cool stuff, and get more value out of the solution. So that's comparing, kind of contrasting that. And then, maybe taking this one step further, let's go look at what we've done with this solution. Actually, I forgot to show you one thing over here. So looking at team resumes and profiles, we got some cool stuff here in terms of, grouping by the consultant and digging in and seeing some stuff there. So looking at this the latest and greatest solution. Oh, I missed it. It's over here. No, you want proposals. One second. So we took that old solution that was certainly a step in the right direction. We're capturing meaningful metadata. We have things organized. We talk about ordering. So certainly, when we're ever in a rush or under duress or stress, we have to have an RFP submitted. The most important thing for us is showing, that bid login information, so I can go to that bid site, log in, and submit an RFP. And then the most important thing are the proposals that we're working on, then followed by those reasonable segments that we have when crafting our proposals. You'll also notice here that when we've come to the landing page, instead of seeing the hundreds and hundreds of proposals and all of the metadata, what we're actually showing you is just those 2 or 3 proposals that are coming up that we're still working on. So again, I don't have to come here and search and filter and try and find the most important proposals that I care about. By default, we're going to show you those main proposals that we're currently working on. I can go dive into those and work on those documents. And of course, we can do all kinds of cool stuff. I can go back to that old view and show you all proposals, and I can then do whatever you want in terms of filtering on province or doing cool stuff or building workflows. All the capability is still there, but maybe taking it one step further and doing that. You'll also notice too, we use a little bit of color on the landing page as well, so you can have two kind of makes it easier to kind of read between the various areas and have your eye follow along using some of that visual appeal tricks. And then, like say, looking at team resumes and profiles. We're also doing some cool stuff like, hey, let's call it the resumes that haven't been updated this year. So we have to constantly update our resumes rather to reflect the latest projects that we've been working on, et cetera. And so being able to do some conditional formatting and call that out visually will help things. And then kind of going back to the presentation, doing other cool stuff. Like, for example, we can send notification emails like, hey, your resume is a bit out of date. Please go and update it and do some of that added value stuff. Another quick example we're working on this week actually for an organization, a municipality doing council meetings, and they were entering in by hand because each document set or folder has to have a name, and they were kind of entering it manually, and they would make the odd mistake with the format of the date or the name of the meeting, etc. So just taking an extra step, creating a Power App that makes that process a little bit easier for them to do that stuff. So Yeah, certainly some high level stuff that's useful for you to think about, really spending the time to create a really great and compelling user experience in SharePoint. Now we can chat about Teams. So interestingly, Teams is super popular right now. Everyone knows it's super useful. And what we're finding is people are kind of kicking off Teams and people are using them, but they're kind of reverting back to old ways of working within network file storage. And what we're seeing is, multiple kinds of various types of content ending up in your team sites. And certainly artificial intelligence is going to help us out with that. But from a security perspective and from an optimal user experience perspective, it may not be hitting all the buttons for us. So notably, and what we've been doing is, so by default, you might look like something like this. You have a team, you have a bunch of folders, and then we have folders and subfolders. We know the problems that we have with that. Interestingly, you can add in a document library. So this is actually me kicking off a team and adding in that document library that we were just looking at. But notably, right now, we don't quite have all that functionality within a library to create views and to search for and filter in a bit more of a meaningful way. But what you can do is you can actually add a page in SharePoint. So if instead of pointing to a specific library, you can point teams to all the various key pages in that SharePoint site, and then we kind of get to reuse all that hard work that we did. So when I come into the team site, through a different vehicle, we can see the same user experience and have the same way of working with that data. And so oftentimes what we're doing with most of our projects right now is we're taking the time to design things properly and thoroughly, and then surfacing that content in Teams at the same time, and allowing end users. We still have people are creatures of habit, and so we allow you to either go to SharePoint or go to Teams, but taking an extra couple of minutes to surface those key pages for people. Yeah, so I got through that fairly quickly. We're into the Q&A, so feel free to ask any questions that you have.
Yeah, feel free to pop over there and put some questions in that Q&A panel. Maybe I'll just ask you, Michael, a question that we get sometimes is from organizations. They've gone down the path of, adding some libraries, adding content. They realize it's not as usable. So what do you recommend in that situation for an organization that's already started, they've gone down the path, and sort of in that, do they start over? How do they move forward?
Yeah, I think it depends where they are in their journey. I would say if they have another area within SharePoint that they're going to be developing a net new solution on, to perhaps take a step back, follow best practices, do some user experience, do some usability testing with people, get their feedback, make it sort of that rich end user SharePoint solution. And then once you've had some lessons learned, then maybe go back and rework the site. So that might take one or two examples to work through, perhaps before your project team is feeling super confident in their ability to dial things in perfectly. So you wouldn't want to go to a half-baked SharePoint site and then kind of fix it and then go back and fix it again, just from like a bit of a change fatigue standpoint for end users. So if possible, go find a net new SharePoint solution, really double down on the user experience, and once your team feels comfortable enough, then circle back to some existing sites and layer that on.
Mm-hmm. Great. So I do see a question here. It's from Dale. So I think we may have answered it with the point teams to pages topic. However, any other tips on how you would apply the single purpose library principle and key user experience principles in the context of a Microsoft Teams space with the SharePoint site behind it?
Yeah, great question. So so I think often what we see right now are people need a team for a project, and the team is spun up, and so it's probably a matter of governance. And so what we are doing, we would take the same approach. We would if it was a rich team site that was going to have longevity, take the time to design it. I guess there's certainly that ROI that you have with this. And so let's say you have an emergency at your organization and you need a team to to deal with that. Like, let's say whatever the situation happens to be, you know, do you want to spend 3 weeks designing and do UAT on the site? No, you need that team site today. You need it now to foster collaboration and whatever happens to be. But you know, if you're crafting up a net new site for HR, I mean SharePoint lives behind the scenes. So really the process doesn't change. You want to do a content audit, you want to design your lists and libraries, you want to create your views, and you would do that all in SharePoint, but then you would also in parallel, you know, craft that team and add the tabs in, have multiple document libraries, so on and so forth within a given team, and kind of recreate that experience within the team's environment. So it really shouldn't change all that much, but I think depending on the nature of the team. And then for repeatable solutions like committees or projects or working groups, etc., you know, certainly take the time to develop a bit of a template for people, so you don't have to kind of do that configuration for every team that gets kicked off.
Mm-hmm. That's great. Okay. If you have any other questions, feel free to leave them there. I don't see anything else coming through, so maybe we'll leave it at that.
Excellent. And then, yeah, so for those of you who are in the middle of your Microsoft 365 implementation or about to start it or perhaps restart it post-pandemic, we've done a couple recent kind of large-scale Microsoft 365 roadmaps with our clients, and so we're going to share our approach and process for tackling that. Yeah, excellent. It's on the 29th of 2021. Well, thank you so much for joining today, and we'll see you hopefully next on April the 29th, the next webinar.